A great magazine moves. You turn the pages, one image relates to another image. Juxtapositions between images is what you've just seen or what you're about to see. It's all that. There's a rhythm. It's like a musical instrument. It's beautiful. Magazines are great. Well, were great. Not anymore, but they were much less. But they were great. They were an important medium. I became interested in magazines in the 80s, not prior to that, when magazines started to feel relevant to me. So when ID magazine came out, it was a magazine in France called Jill magazine. Very important French magazine, fashion. ID, Jill, The Face. Those are the ones I was reading and excited. Right. And also, media was so different because it was way before the internet. When the shows happened, you didn't see anything from the shows for months. Really. But when the magazine came out, you would have only a few shops that would sell international magazines. So if you wanted to get hold of a copy of Italian Vogue or Jill magazine or whatever it was, you would really have to fight to get them because everybody else wanted them too. And they only got 5 copies in each show. And if you didn't get it, that was it. You didn't see it. I remember when Bruce Weber did the Olympics. I think that was for Interview magazine. You got hold of a copy of that. That was like a treasure. You just show it to people you loved and cared about. It was so exciting.
I'm Jill Demling, and this is Going Rogue. Today's guest is Nick Knight, the image maker who has spent 4 decades expanding what fashion imagery can be, how it communicates, and how far it can stretch. Across ID, The Face, Vogue, W, and SHOWstudio, Nick has built a career questioning the assumption that images record reality. He said, "Photography is not about capturing what you see. It's about creating what you want to see. Once you hear that, you stop looking at pictures as evidence and start understanding them as intention, construction, and imagination." From documenting street culture and skinhead and at ID, to his early collaborations with Yohji Yamamoto, to the botanical portraits of flora, to Linda Evangelista's now iconic Ring Flash British Vogue cover from 1993, to the founding of SHOWstudio, Nick has continually shifted the way images are made and the way we experience fashion itself. And now in SHOWstudio's 25th year, he's released a brand new film called Naturally, a project I was lucky enough to cast. It's Nick Knight in full evolution mode, bold, inventive, future-facing, and the next step in a journey he's been on for decades, reimagining how fashion is seen, shared, and experienced, and what an image can be tomorrow. This episode is about imagination, experimentation, and the freedom to build visuals that didn't exist until you made them. Let's hear from the man who refuses to let the image sit still as Nick Knight goes rogue. To see the images we discussed today, head to our Instagram at goingrogue.podcast. Hi, Nick. Welcome to Going Rogue.
Hi, Joe. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, this podcast celebrates the era of the magazine, the editors, stylists, and image makers who shaped the culture we live in, and you truly redefined how we see beauty, fashion, and even photography itself. You've said some things that stuck with me for weeks. Photography is not about capturing what you see. It's about creating what you want to see. The things that form our experience of reality don't exist at all in the way a camera takes a photograph. This realization made me convinced that photography was not very good at showing truth, and therefore should be as free of that burden as painting is. If you want reality, just go and stand there. The photograph you insist is not evidence, it's intention. It made me think about my photo albums, me and my sister smiling on the beach. I actually went through my whole photo box. We were really happy. Or were we just saying cheese? There's not a single photo of my daughter frowning in her baby book. I didn't edit out the reel. I just captured what I wanted to see. And once you start thinking that way, you start to question what any image really is, because everything you've done from ID to Vogue to SHOWstudio has been about redefining that question. What's real, what's constructed, and what's worth showing in the world. You've said photography should be freed from the burden of truth. But I started to think, what if the intention of the photographer is to capture truth or what's real? Is it possible to do that then?
Well, that's a big question, Joe.
Yeah.
It relies on a whole bunch of agreed pre-constructs how to answer it. It depends how you see truth. It depends what you're looking for in trying to show truth, so your reason to show it.
Right.
I mean, as you just read so eloquently, and please send me a text of those quotes.
Yeah.
You sound like I know what I'm talking about. But as you sort of said in the introduction, I don't think photography is a particularly good way of bringing an objective truth to things. It's always a subjective vision of life at best. I've always felt that photography doesn't work like the eye works. It doesn't work like we work as humans. It's a very mechanical process, an optical mechanical process. So no, I don't. I don't think photography should be looked on as being able to bring the truth. But of course, there are different levels of the truth. Some information is better than no information. You can make up your mind if you're given some facts. If you're given no facts, it's just shooting in the dark. It's just sort of a guess. But if you're given some facts, and photography can give you some facts, or some opinions, let's say, not facts, then it helps. But I don't think it's a very good medium. I mean, even less so these days.
Right.
I know it's better than anything else. When photography first came along, it was replacing, to some degree, the role of painting. So they would send out. The example I use is a photographer called Roger Fenton, who weirdly was an English landscape and still life photographer. And he was sent out to the battlefields of the Crimean War to bring back to the British public the horrors of war and to try and sort of make a case for, I guess, probably anti-war, but who knows, what bit of propaganda he was supposedly backing up. But that's what I mean by the truth. It wasn't really even his truth. He was sent out to deliver a message back. And he then shaped what he saw through his ground glass screen of his plate camera on the battlefields of the Crimea. He dragged bodies from one side of a road to another, and he pushed cannonballs closer to the camera. And he tried in some way to sort of create the message he already wanted to say through the things in front of his camera. What he didn't show, we don't know. How much he changed things to get his point across, we don't know. And that's his vision of a truth, and it's better than somebody sitting there with an easel and a bunch of paint.
Right.
Bring the whole thing in. So it is better than painting to bring an idea of truth, but it's never been what I wanted to do. I don't really feel there's one truth, not in any way an advocate for the sort of post-truth situation we feel sometimes we find ourselves in. I'd like to know an idea of truth, especially when it comes to the sort of decisions that are made about our lives. But, there are always different versions of facts. There are always two sides to the story. There is always a kind of a reason to say these things. And sometimes it's more important than the message itself, why they're saying it, why people want to say it.
Right. Since you've worked with every major magazine in the world, I thought the best way to tell this story and keep it within an hour would be to focus on two you're most associated with. ID, where it all began, and British Vogue, where you helped reshape fashion photography for a new generation. I'm going to throw out a few clusters of questions your way, more like prompts, but honestly, I just want you to tell the story. What that era felt like, how your work evolved, and what was happening creatively and technologically around you. You've said a great image has to do three things. It has to get your attention, it has to start to tell you a story, and it has to let you finish the story yourself. Each era of your career seems to express one of those ideas. Attention in your early work with ID, the cinematic worlds of Vogue and Visionaire, and participation in the live interactive space of SHOWstudio. So that's how I'd like to go through it today, not as a timeline, but as an evolution of how images communicate and how we as viewers become part of them. So let's start with the boy who was supposed to be a doctor and ended up painting on negatives. So I'm going to give the listeners a quick bit of background to get us to ID. You were born in London to a family of scientists. Your plan was medicine, but you hated it. You dropped out and enrolled in art school with no artistic training at all. You've said photography was a way of having some sort of social purpose, I guess. It started very mundanely as a bit of social interaction. But I took it up as a career because I was doing something I hated, human biology. Photography was the only thing I was any good at, the only thing in my education that I shone at. At art school, you started painting black ink directly onto negatives, baffling your tutors. You said, when I first started, there were an awful lot of presumptions about photography. I began changing photography, painting on negatives, collages, a very manipulative approach. And about that first image, I had no idea what it was, what its function was, what it was supposed to describe, but I wanted to create it. You've said all you can do is follow your desires. Always try to create images you want to see, not images you can see. That summer, while working on an off license, you befriended a skinhead and started photographing the scene. Your book, Skinhead, was published when you were just 23, and it changed everything. So you've said about that first image, I had no idea what it was, what its function was, what it was supposed to describe, but I just wanted to create. When did that impulse turn into intention? When did you start to understand what you were actually trying to see that didn't exist?
I mean, it certainly wasn't back when I first started. I think the major thing when I first started photography was the release from having to sort of do a subject I wasn't any good at. I had no application or real kind of acceptance to spend my whole of my later teenage years life studying, every name of every fiber and nerve ending and bone in the body. And I wasn't particularly good at it. Well, probably because I wasn't interested, but also I just wasn't engaged. So switching to art college was a huge change. And also doing something that I loved was a huge change, and finding that the more I did it, the more I loved it. I enrolled in the college, and the first day the college opened at 9 o'clock, I was there at 8 o'clock just waiting. And as I walked through the doors of the college, I never looked back. I've never felt any less of a love of photography than when I first started. It's just grown and grown in me. It was a release of so many feelings of frustration, and I was going nowhere, and life wasn't going to really be very good for me. And then all of a sudden I found something that allowed me to experience life in every way possible. I could walk up to people I liked the look of and ask to take their photograph. Later in my career, I could photograph any president or monarch or prostitute or miner or lorry driver or anything you're interested in. So the world that seemed so out of my direct touch, suddenly I had a way into any part of it, any social part of it, just as the photography is a sort of passport into life. So I started photographing skinheads quite quickly because it was something I was interested in from some not so far ago past, from when I was a teenager. And I realized there was nobody really documenting this particularly strange British youth cult, and it was fascinating. There's a whole bunch of kind of personal issues involved to do with social politics and sexual finding oneself and all that sort of stuff. It was sort of a bit of a coming of age, I think. People, when they go from child to adult, go through a sort of self-definition moment or self-experimentation to find out who you are. And it was, as a young art student, it was very open for me to investigate that. Had I been a doctor, that would have not been so possible, or any other profession, to be honest. So photography really allows you this sort of immersion to any part of life, however sort of removed from your own direct experience, anything you're interested in. And so skinheadism was something I was interested in, and what I did was do a series of photographs. It took me about a year, 9 months to do them, threw me into a whole bunch of situations which were kind of out of my depth socially, I think. Situations which I wasn't ever particularly scared, but they were scary. As if you're in the middle of a sort of gang fight, people are throwing bits of scaffolding and bricks at you, or holding a knife to your spine.
Yeah, like a war photographer in a way.
I mean, it's probably, I guess, yes. The couple of, just probably about 3 or 4 incidents I was involved in as a photographer, and they were, in retrospect, were probably quite dodgy in terms of what could have physically happened to me. Tell you a small story. I've been photographing a big fight in West London, and as I was trying to get out of the area, a bunch of the kind of kids from West London knew I wasn't part of that, because it's very territorial, like a lot of big cities. And I was with a bunch of East End skinheads, so their whole mission was to kind of, not make life very happy for us. And I didn't know, 'cause I didn't realize, but somebody was standing behind me with a knife drawn, waiting for me to raise my fist or do anything. So, those sort of things, as I say, I wasn't scared, but they are scary.
Right.
Those are the sort of situations I wouldn't normally want to find myself in. And then I met a bunch of people who varied from every part of society. And some were sort of very extreme in their politics. Some were very confused in their sexuality. I remember this is the end of the 1970s, and nobody was out.
Right.
So there was a lot of hiding going on. There's a lot of kind of affront and stuff behind that.
Yeah, I interviewed Garen yesterday, and he was married during that time.
So
So,
a little bit, and certainly on the sort of street level, British working class was not going to accept people being gay at that point. Just starting at that point, I guess. But so it was a very, very different world, and it was a hugely different world in terms of the sort of accepted politics of the country, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It bears no relationship to what we're living now at all.
right.
That was my sort of first immersion, but it became a cheap little book and was published and I moved on. I think I probably made very, very little money from the book over the years. But the nice thing is that people seem to recognize it. And I remember Jean-Paul Gaultier saying to me, it's his favorite book. And I think it has a sort of a little bit of a weird cult status, but it made me no money whatsoever. It was not important. I never wanted to photograph another youth cult or immerse myself in that sort of idea of socio-documentary photography. And when I first started doing pictures of skinheads, it really wasn't to do that. It was to cut out the pictures and write on them and draw on them and all the things you mentioned in your intro. I had no idea how to process a film, so I was literally experimenting with it as if it was a new medium. And my first approach to skinhead, I was very inspired when I first started by people like, Rodchenko and some of the Russian constructivist photographers, the propaganda photographers, and people from the Bauhaus, but people like Kurt Schwitters, and people who were cutting things up and writing on things, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, to try and form a reality, a physical reality of what they saw. And so that's how I first started skinhead. So I was photographing boobs and then making a collage and writing across them, or photographing, whatever it was, backs of people's heads, and to literally cut them out, put it on a piece of paper, photograph it, to draw on, et cetera, et cetera. So it was collage originally. But I was showing them, as I was developing the pictures at college, one of my lecturers, who was an American chap, said to me, why the hell are you cutting these up? Just print what's on the bloody negative. Why are you making such a meal out of this? These pictures are interesting, and just print what's on your negative. And so I was like, oh, okay. So I did that.
Right.
That's what happened. But I didn't really want to be, another Don McCullin or Tim Page or any of those guys. I wasn't that sort of photographer. I wasn't into it. And I was into skinheads for the music and for how they dressed and for what skinhead girls looked like and all that sort of stuff. So
it's interesting because I was thinking I went into college as a math major and then I switched to art, and my paintings I can see the remnants of the math coming into the art before I could free myself of that. I just wonder if some of what you're studying at the beginning had anything to do with how you were looking at art or photography.
It always has been. If you approach a problem as a scientist, you don't approach it in the same way that you would do to trying to create an image. I approach my work in a very sort of, let's try this and see what it works and base it on that.
Mm-hmm.
Scientific approach, really. So when you're judging the results, and if your result doesn't match up with what you predicted to be, it's just as valid as if it does match up. So therefore, when you're taking a photograph, if you extrapolate that way of working onto photography, with some of the things coming out of the camera that you didn't expect, and often, not always, often they are super interesting. And mistakes, things that don't go right, quite frequently it's a bit like you seeing a chink in the armor. So you're opening a door you didn't expect to open, and you're seeing into somewhere else. So mistakes are really important in the whole process of creating an image. Although they don't feel very nice when you do them, if you're standing in front of a young Cindy Crawford or Naomi Campbell or Robert De Niro, whoever it is, and the first picture that comes out is rubbish, which it often is, that's a humbling experience to accept that failure in front of people you care about a lot. Their opinion, and you're desperate to impress them, and you're desperate to try and create an image of them that they're going to go, wow. And then the first thing that comes out of the camera, whether you see it on a Polaroid or you see it on a screen, whatever the tech is, I've always been quite happy to allow the whole of the team, including the person I'm photographing, to see what I'm doing. The first one that comes out is awful. The lighting's wrong, you haven't got the mood, the clothes look wrong, the hair's wrong, the makeup's wrong, everything's wrong. And the picture's usually rubbish. And that failing in front of somebody who you are incredibly impressed by or want to impress, is very humbling. It's not a nice feeling.
Right.
It's a very unpleasant feeling, but you have to incorporate that into your practice, into what you do, into how you work. You can't hide it away, and you shouldn't hide it away. The more we allow ourselves to be open to our failings, the better, I think.
For sure.
It is part of that scientific approach, I guess.
Yeah.
Where I'm analytical in what I look at. So if somebody puts a girl in a dress in front of me, I'm trying to understand what that dress means, or how that model is presenting it to me, because what she's wearing is a whole bunch of information. This is why I've been very against the narrative in a fashion film. I don't want to leap too far ahead, because when you have a great piece of clothing, I can imagine a fantastic Dior piece by John Galliano, there's so much already infused into that dress, the colors, the textures, the material, the cut, the shape, the form, the references, etc., etc., etc. For you to stick another dull layer on top of that, say, yeah, but it's just costume and we're just going to make the girl look like she's in love with something, who cares? So that's why a lot of my work is on a clean white background or a clean grey background, because I'm not really interested in creating a story around it. I'm interested in seeing and understanding what John Galliano was trying to get through, and hopefully in seeing that, I can present that in a way which feels like a summation of what his mindset was. And that's nearly always the approach I've used when I'm working. And I've been lucky enough to work with John Galliano, Alexander McQueen, Yohji Yamamoto, some of the great designers who I have a huge amount of respect for. So, and that's been my privilege, and I've been able to work with them. So, there are things to understand there. And I grew up through an era of photography which is very much about creating a scene. So the Newtons, the Bourdains, the Christian Wagenheims, the Deborah Turvilles, the Sarah Moons, the Bruce Webbers, etc., was everything that I was reacting against. First came on the scene, the whole sexuality of photography, the whole sort of idea that people like Newton were all about his sexual obsessions, that Bourdain was about love and death, or sex and death, that Chris von Wagenheim, all those guys, including Weber and including Deborah Turberville and all, they were sort of, not so much Deborah Turberville and Sarah Moon, but sort of certainly the male photographers of the time were really encouraged to express their sexuality through their work. And by the early 1980s, when I came on the scene, that was a bit naff. And also, I really didn't want to do that.
And were you reading magazines prior to ID? Were you interested in the photographers that were shooting in these magazines?
No, I wasn't interested in them. Not disrespectfully, they're
right.
Newton, Bruce Weber, they're fantastic photographers. So please don't think I'm trying to say anything. But at the time, as a kind of slightly arrogant teenager or in my early 20s, I hadn't been looking at magazines. I'd been looking at record covers.
Right.
That's back in the day when your record cover was this big and you had a picture taken by Norman Seeff of Chaka Khan and Rufus. That was what I've been staring at for 10 years, right back from the beginning of the sort of 1970s. That was where I found my pleasure, that you would buy a record by whoever it was and then just sit and listen to it and stare at the album or take it apart bit by bit, whether it's a Pink Floyd record or a Syd Barrett or whoever, Chic or Sister Sledge, they're all relevant. And that was what I really wanted to do. I really wanted to take pictures of the people I loved and musically, but there was no connect there at all.
Interesting.
I was hugely into soul music, and especially female vocal. So people like Chaka Khan were kind of, when she was with Rufus, were my sort of, and still is, to be honest.
I just booked her for the FTA event to perform.
Oh, really?
So I've been in Chaka Khan world for the past 3 weeks.
She has no idea I exist, but she was the soundtrack to all of my youth. That still is. Still, her vocal can still just send my emotions.
And you never photographed her?
No, I'm not sure it's a good idea, to be honest.
Oh.
Well, because I have such a formulated vision of her from 50 years ago. I don't, but no, I never have. I've been always slightly kind of, should I push, but I don't know if it's a good idea. Hello from me to her.
Yes.
Hello, I'm
exactly.
a fan.
So the indie magazines, ID, you've said a great image has to do 3 things. The first thing you do is you have to get people's attention. That's what a memorable image will do, first of all. That's where it all began, getting attention, breaking through, being seen. Around the same time as Skinhead was published, ID was building a visual identity under founder Terry Jones and art director Robin Derrick, a mix of rebellion, humor, and street instinct. And that curiosity is what brought you to ID. You've said the likes of Vogue and Elle weren't going to have anything to do with me at that point. So I found my place at ID. ID was a photocopied rebellion, chaotic, handmade, alive. You've said I went to see Terry at Sheriff Road, which is where ID was at the time. They published my pictures of skinheads, and then I did more pictures of my friends in Bournemouth.
Yeah, little seaside town, South Coast of Britain.
Okay, odd types, rockabillys, and different groups. When you met Terry, he explained the idea of straight ups. He said we take people as they are on the street, how they naturally are. And that's what the core of ID is. That's what ID used to be like back then. It was very handmade. Everyone put it together in the attic of Terry's flat. The magazine's credo, the streets are the catwalks of the world, matched the way you saw things. It wasn't about fantasy, it was about friction. You called it charmingly disorganized, but that chaos was its magic, raw, human, unfiltered. You weren't documenting a scene, you were inventing one. You've said at the time, I saw photography as a way to find out about the world around me. That's what propelled me, curiosity about the world and people. You've called photography a passport to life, from bar fights to Buckingham Palace. So you said great images have to stop you. It has to interpret reality, not describe it. Did that idea start with the straight ups? What were those early shoots like, and what made an ID picture work? And just anything about those ID years and how you were developing or seeing yourself as an artist.
Okay. When I was at college, I spent any possible moment where I wasn't in the darkroom or photographing in the library. So I was in the library researching to every photographer that had ever lived. Because you come from a science background, all of a sudden you're in the arts. So I made it my cause to just be absolutely in the library all the time, going through every book. So I have came out with quite a love of photography and a knowledge of photography. And one of the visiting lecturers at Bournemouth and Bourg College Art was a woman called Sue Mann, who was the art director of British Vogue after Terry Jones. You have to get this straight, because I'm not sure I'm getting this right.
Yes.
Terry Jones, who runs ID magazine, was at British Vogue. He got frustrated at British Vogue because they said, oh, punk's just a fad. Forget it. We're not covering it. And he said, no, it's a really important cultural movement. And Vogue like, no, it's just kids, just forget them. We don't want anything to do with it. So Terry said, well, okay, but I think it's really exciting. So I'm going to leave Vogue and start ID magazine. I got to ID magazine because I was just going around any publication, from Zigzag magazine to, anything that would publish my pictures. I would work. When I first started, and while I was at college, I would work for anybody at all. And I think I would advise that to anybody who's starting out. Just work. I had a little portfolio of pictures, and I was going around to London, going into shops and saying, hey, I take pictures. Can I do something for you? Going to magazines, going to record companies. Anybody who would see me, I would go and see. And on the street at the time, there was this new magazine starting up called ID Magazine, which would probably be good for me to go and see. And so I did. So I went to, as you say, Sheriff Road in West Hampstead, saw Terry, who was a very lovely, very likable man, and he had been the art director of British Vogue. And at the time, I'd been called into British Vogue to do an interview. So Sue Mann said, come and see what British Vogue's like. See if you want to work in the art department. So I thought, well, okay, well, maybe. So I went in there, and it was like going to, NatWest Bank. It was so corporate, and I was expecting kind of Cecil Beaton and kind of, drama and lights, and it's like going into a corporate office for a bank. It was the most uncreative environment. And I just thought, this is really disappointing. No, I really do not want to be here. Right. I want to go out and live and experience life and not just sit here at a desk all day long. So I didn't do that. I was very interested by Terry Jones because he'd left Vogue magazine and he'd started ID. And so therefore my sort of constructed world of what fashion was about, based on people like Horst and Newton, started to crumble straight away. I started to see that actually the sort of mainstream fashion was not interested and not interesting for me at that point. I went to one of the other magazines that remain nameless, with my pictures of skinheads, and they were horrified. They said, oh, no, we want pictures of pretty girls in pretty dresses. And I was thinking, well, these girls are really pretty. What's your problem? Exactly. I wasn't going to fit in on anybody else's terms, so I had to sort of reassess how I could make a living in this world, and how I can continue doing something I was enjoying. And so I stumbled across ID by being recommended to go and see Terry. I phoned him up and he said, yeah, come down. And so I went down and showed him my work, which included some pictures of the skinheads. And then he published, rather reluctantly, the pictures of skinheads before the book came out. So the book was due out in November or something. I think correctly. And he published it 2 or 3 months before the book was due out. Terry was really very strongly anti-fascist, really strongly. And not that my work or that I was a fascist, far from it. But of course, there is that notion around kind of the other right wing and skinheads, which is not particularly well borne out in practice. But of course, now it's become even more, blah, blah, blah. But back in those days, it was even more confused. And I think there was a deliberate promotion of the right wing in Britain using the youth, and the skinheads fitted well into that. Right. So, really, it was just a sort of, I think, a hijacking of some of the values of British working class youth into this sort of rather political meaning by what was then the National Front or far-right organisations. But, it is also true that skinheadism came from the British working class in the 1960s, and the British working class in the 1960s tended to be more racist than you would want them to be, because, of course, they're a working class, tight-knit community. Right. Having to deal with immigration, also being told it's acceptable to have those views. So if you look at British television of the 1970s, you've got things like Till Death Us Do Part, Love Thy Neighbour, in a lot of comedies, where it was quite okay to say the N-word. It was quite okay to say the P-word. It was quite okay to be very misogynistic, very racist, very sexist, etc., etc., etc. That was British comedy. Look at British comedy. So that was... Yeah. Britain in the 1970s was so weird. So weird. The one show that kids had to watch to see the music was called Top of the Pops. Now, Top of the Pops was every Thursday night, and all British youth virtually would try and watch it. So next day at school, everybody would be talking about it. And Top of the Pops was hosted by the famous paedophile Jimmy Savile. So Jimmy Savile was a kind of one of the main 4 or 5 people that hosted Top of the Pops. So you've got this weird, completely unsavory looking character called Jimmy Savile presenting the music you love. So that automatically made you feel a bit like, well, I don't really get this. He just looks really weird. If you ever saw pictures of Jimmy Savile, he just looked odd. And then, of course, he was part of every bit of light entertainment you saw on television, because your only culture came from television, really, much more than from film.
Right.
And so the way that Jimmy Savile was presented in light entertainment was like he was all over the place. He was with the royal family. He was presenting sports programs. He was doing charity runs. He had a program called Jim Will Fix It, which he certainly tried to. So you have this absolutely predatory paedophile right across British media. So if you think the racism was my problem, it was, but it was like with all of the other problems
right
with it. And the sort of way the British saw themselves at the time, such a strange era to...
Oh my God, I'm just looking. This is so very strange. I know Dick Page talks about Top of the Pops, that whole time period, the youth quake, and I mean, a little bit more.
Or anything. There were only 2 programs which dealt with popular music at the time. The main one by a million miles was Top of the Pops. It was 7:25 on a Thursday evening. Everybody watched it. The only other one was called the Old Grey Whistle Test, and it was kind of indie music. So basically, 70s version of hippies. Although they did start putting punk on it quite early. But anyway, it was the kind of more serious music at late at night. Anyway, not quite what we've got into Pops and paedophiles, but life didn't make sense. So I think the whole of the sort of right-wing thing that skinheads became involved in was partly a co-opting from right-wing groups like the National Front into using this sort of whole myth of kind of patriotism and et cetera, et cetera. But there were a lot of skinheads who were not right-wing at all. They were left-wing skinheads. And also, if you think where skinheadism came from in the 60s, it was Jamaican music. It was the dance halls, which were full of West Indians. And they were the coolest dressers, the coolest dancers, the best looking, the strongest. Yeah, they were the best. And white youth really admired Jamaican kids. It was at the beginning of immigration in Britain. So our society was really not knowing quite what to do. And you had race riots and you had all manner of kind of difficult social moments. But that was more in the early 60s. But by the time 1970s had come, football became the main preoccupation. Anyway, we're way off topic here.
From ID. It's the time period, it's important to get.
slightly disorientating culture I grew up with was that presented across British media. As I said, you saw most of your stuff on television. You go to the cinema once every 2 months, and I certainly wasn't reading books. And magazines were things like Honey, and what else was a magazine? Vogue occasionally, Nova magazine, which was a little bit more exciting. But most of my culture came from record covers. So consequently, when I started fashion photography, which is what I always wanted to do. I always wanted to be a fashion photographer. I didn't want to be a social documentary or any other vision of photography. I was really interested, and still am. Still really.
But even at ID, were you thinking fashion, like after the experience going into Vogue? Well, you can tell in Skinheads. I mean, looking at that now, I see fashion.
Yeah, of course, it was.
Yeah.
What was happening there was a fashion that I could relate to.
Yeah.
So youth culture, I understood all of that language. So on the street, I understood what it meant when your button was a bit more high or a bit more low, or the lapel's a different shape. All of that sort of coding that goes into kind of youth cults and what they wear is fashion.
Yeah.
It was a fashionable cult. When it first started, it was a mixture of different cultural things. So Jamaican yardies and Jamaican dancehall kids, plus English working class. Anything that wasn't dandy, so anti kind of Carnaby Street, anti the Beatles and psychedelia. So anything that was sort of hard work wear, like what your father might have worn if you lived on the Docklands or whatever. It was tough workwear mixed with this sort of Jamaican influence. And it was a fashion, and it emerged in about 1967 and then continued to change. Well, first of all, it's called Peanuts. And then secondly, it was called Skinhead. And then after Skinhead became Suede Head, and then Suede Head became Smoothie, and different. When you got to Suede Head, it was much more to do with mimicking London city gents with bowler hats and Crombies and velvet collars and all that sort of thing. An umbrella. It's exactly how I look when I go out today. Exactly how I look still. So you don't really get over these things. I have stayed stylistically true to what I was when I was sort of 16, 17. Before 16, I was all over the place. I had Joe in Deck in Venice. I thought that was where I wanted to look. I had my hair bleached and permed. I used to wear makeup. Tried everything.
Yeah, Julien, when I had him on, talks a lot about Death in Venice. Like he said, he looked. I mean, it's amazing. I went back. I actually have to watch it because the fact that it's come up twice from two totally different. It's fascinating that a movie could do so much. But did Robin and Terry give you total freedom, or?
Robin was a kid. He was a student. He wasn't employed at ID magazine. He'd come in every 2 or 3 days.
Oh,
Terry was the person who ran it, and the person closest to him was a girl called Moira Bogue, was the sort of his right-hand assistant type. She was more professional and engaged full time. Terry saw lots of different students, just like I do at SHOWstudio. One of them was Robin Derrick. So it wasn't that he was the art director there. Terry was the art director. That's who we were working with.
right?
Lay things out and paste things up and, put typography on and stuff like that. But that wasn't his only, he was there like a couple of days a week at the beginning. I think he became more full time. But it was Terry's show. I mean,
Right.
for historical accuracy, ID started Perry Haynes, who used to manage a band called King. He was one of the people. Al McDowell, who is now a very, very well-respected art director globally. I think he has a practice out in LA. There was 3 of them that started it. Al McDowell, Terry Jones, and Perry Haynes. Then I think after about issue number 1, Perry Haynes and Al McDowell went on to do their own thing, and Terry continued to do it himself. So he was the main guy there. And he was the person that I was in awe of because he had such a joyfully disrespectful relationship to photography. I remember him telling me that he thought that you really didn't need a photographer, you just needed a machine. Just send somebody in a photo booth. Fine. So he wasn't interested in photography. I think he spent, 10 years at Vogue with all those photographers like David Bailey insisting there was a black key line around his pictures and no type on it. And all the kind of slightly overrun, because the photographer was a big thing. Fashion photography was a big thing in the 60s and 70s. Photographers didn't see the magazine. They saw their own work laid out in a magazine.
Right.
Magazine's a portfolio. It's not. A magazine, a great magazine, it moves. You turn the pages, one image relates to another image. Juxtapositions between images, it's what you've just seen or what you're about to see. It's all that. There's a rhythm in a magazine. It's like a musical instrument. It's beautiful. That's what photographers didn't see. They saw magazines as a portfolio printed. And that's
Right.
when I became consulting picture editor, in the 90s, that's what I had to deal with, try to educate photographers like Jürgen Teller or Dave Sims or Corin Day about what actually work in the magazine is. It's not about, yes, Jürgen, you've got 20 great pictures, but we've only got 10 pages. So, try and work with that. It's the wonderful dynamic of a magazine. Magazines are great, or were great, not anymore, but they much less. But they were great. They were an important medium. I became interested in magazines in the 80s, not prior to that, when magazines started to feel relevant to me. So when ID magazine came out, it was a magazine in France called Jill magazine.
I read about that, yeah.
Very important French magazine, fashion. I wasn't so involved in Interview magazine because it was very American and to do with hugely famous people. Well, not either of those. So ID, Jill, The Face, those are the ones I was reading and excited. And also media was so different because it was way before the internet, way before any of that stuff. So when the shows happened, you didn't see anything from the shows for months. Really months. You the way Verge did 6 months to do so well, I cried. But when the magazine came out, I was talking to Philippe Garner, who was one of the heads of Sotheby's, who organised the sale of the Saint Laurent estate and promoted photography in the 1970s. We were reminiscing about how you would have only a few shops that would sell international magazines. So if you wanted to get hold of a copy of Italian Vogue or Jill magazine or Interview or whatever it was, you would really have to fight to get them because everybody else wanted them too. And if they only got 5 copies in or, whatever, and they'd go. And if you didn't get it, that was it. You didn't see it. So media was a lot harder to access then. And it was always like, I'd see it. Because if you got hold of a copy of, I remember when Bruce Weber did the Olympics, I think that was for Interview magazine, you got hold of a copy of that. That was like a treasure. You'd show it to people you loved and cared about. And it was so exciting because that was the only window into any of those lives. Like the record cover used to be the only window into musicians like Chaka Khan. You'd sit there and you'd look at them. Of course, she'd had her session with Norman Seaforth, whoever it would have been at the time. So you studied and studied and studied. So it felt a lot more hard to get hold of any media. To hear a new song, you couldn't hear on the radio. Most of the stuff that I was into, or a lot of kids are into, you just couldn't hear on mainstream radio. So you'd have to seek out the records. So you'd have to find somewhere that sold them, and you have to buy one. And that was the only one you could hear. You couldn't hear anywhere else where they weren't playing them anywhere. So when punk first started, the only place you could hear half this stuff was Vivian and Malcolm's shop on the King's Road, which is why it became such a magnet for people of that interest. And the dance music, the soul of all-dayers and all-nighters. You'd have to go away for a weekend where a DJ would have gone to America, bought a bunch of 7-inch singles and brought them back and be playing them on the dance floor. And that's the only place you'd hear them. So it's a kind of weird thing now. It's so easy to hear music from all around the world, which is brilliant. I'm not advocating going to that. Just to try and say it was a very, very different world in terms of how we assume culture. So films like Death in Venice became incredibly important for people growing up. I'm really honest, I'd never seen Death in Venice. Never watched it. I was having this conversation with Philippe Garner as well the other day, because that's not how I digest information, I've worked out. I spend my whole time telling people to watch films I've never seen. So we should rewatch Death in Venice, it's brilliant, because I've seen the stills.
Right.
I'm a photographer. I take a still, I decode it. So in Venice, I know what Taggio looked like. I know what Dirk Bogart looked like. I know roughly the story plot. It's enough. The Night Porter, fantastic film. Never seen it. So, these things, you take what you need from them. Now, of course, it's very easy. Back in the day, I couldn't get into The Night Porter. It would have been an 18. I wasn't going to get into an 18. Same thing with Clockwork Orange, incredibly important film, especially in my upbringing, which I did manage to sneak into because it was an 18, but I managed to get in at the age of 13, 14, whatever.
Right.
They were very rare cultural events. So why Studio picks up on them is because there wasn't a multitude of them. There were very few. And therefore, they are the same ones for all of us. The Night Porter was the same for me as it would have been for him. He would know that reference. I would know that reference without even seeing the film, because you'd seen the film poster. So
and he said something about, I think, John Galliano in Death in Venice. There was some connection there. Maybe he did a show referencing it, but it was just...
Oh, yeah.
Yeah,
John,
it was interesting.
You have the whole dilemma of a beautiful young boy and a very much older man who's in love with this young boy in a love he can't express. And weirdly, the actor Dirk Bogarde, who played this, couldn't express it in real life either. He was gay, couldn't come out. A lover and a partner couldn't say it. So he swore that he wasn't, had to pretend he wasn't, which is dreadful. It was illegal to be gay in England up until the 1960s, for Christ's sake. So, we were in a very repressed, minimalized, controlled vision of what society and culture looked like. So all of a sudden, when I discovered photography, it's like the world opens up. I can go down to a gay club, I can photograph in a gay club, or I can go to a bar fight, and I don't want to go to that happens.
Right.
You get involved. I could go and spend my time with some young girl from a council estate, just photographing her back in her house or whatever, or some guy from a council estate who would normally in society I wouldn't have any reason to have anything to do with, but photography gave me that. And then as you become more accepted by your photography, then you get, photographing rock stars and film stars and everything else. But that wasn't really what I was trying to do. I was just trying to photograph fashion that I understood. And at the time, as in my late teens, early 20s, I understood the fashion of the British streets. I didn't understand Paris. I was never shown it. I would understand it. The only way I saw it was through the album covers of Grace Jones. Right. So that's where I would get my idea of Le Bandouche and Upset or whatever it was, through that. And then there were music magazines that covered the music and therefore to some degree the lifestyle. But that's when the Face ID started. That was why they were so important, because they spoke to this whole audience who had no exposure to mainstream fashion and very little interest in it, but had a great exposure to street fashion, a great exposure to music. So that's why it was so important. But to get back onto track, Terry Jones's idea, which I think was brilliant, I still think it's brilliant, is that his ethos was to say to people, you are fantastic the way you are. You don't have to change. You don't have to go and spend $200 or $2,000 buying a shirt from Gucci or whoever it was, Saint Laurent, whoever it would be, because actually you're fantastic as you are. You don't need to change. The reason we want to include you in the magazine is because we think you're fantastic. Whereas most magazines are set up on this aspirational thing. Say, well, if you wore this beautiful white shirt from Frank Foster, you would look as cool as the person in the picture does. But that wasn't how ID worked. ID worked to say, you are fantastic as you are. That's it. It was the first magazine to do that, I believe. And it was, for me, felt like a breath of fresh air. So all of my sort of dreams of being at Vogue suddenly kind of went, don't want to be part of that. It's not a world I know about. It's not the world that exists at Vogue. So I went from ID magazine and I worked there. I did lots of stories for ID magazine. I did lots of portraits. I didn't do much straight ups, which is just where you go in the streets and you wait to see somebody who you think looks great and you photograph them, ask them what they're wearing, what's the name, what they do. This is what a straight up is. It's not very interesting photography unless you're August Sander and you want to drag your 10-8 around the countryside, but I didn't. When I'd done my moment with the skinheads, I wasn't interested in going back there. So I was only semi-interested in that part of ID magazine. What I started getting interested in, I met up with a young stylist called Simon Foxton. Simon Foxton is a brilliant stylist, brilliant, and very lovely man, and also very, very different to me. And he introduced me to gay clubs, he introduced me to the whole of black gay culture in London, which I knew nothing about black culture for a start. And certainly to see it through his eyes, his vision of a beautiful man is a beautiful black man. And this is from a white, very middle class, very gentle young man who'd grown up near Scotland in a remote and beautiful part of Britain, who had seen nobody like that in the whole of his life. Right. In books or on record covers or whatever. So he was obsessed with that way of being, and all his styling. But he's super clever. He went to St. Martin, same time as John Galliano, and he started a small fashion brand, but he didn't really want to pursue the brand. He wanted to pursue styling. So I worked with Simon, and he and I worked together and just created these stories, which we released through ID magazine. They were investigations into all manner of things, but just stuff that we loved. And not just showing it like in the sort of social documentary, this is what this person looks like, but creating things with that knowledge and that past. And Simon is particularly cultured, particularly refined, adorable person. I mean, lovely, he's my best friend for years. And he and I worked together for ages. And we used to go across to Paris and we photograph stuff around Place de Clichy and all of the kind of red light districts in Paris with stories up there of people we like the look of. So we would take somebody we'd seen on the street and we'd ask them if they'd model for us, and then we'd put them into one of our kind of fantasy stories which we were building. One of which was Edward Enninful.
Right.
Late
So it's
80s.
almost like this makes sense now when Vogue comes.
Extraordinarily.
Yeah.
So just the story is, just to
Right.
get our facts straight if it's of any interest to anybody. For the beginning of the 80s, I worked for Terry Jones with Simon Fox, and that was my whole output. And I loved it, absolutely loved it. It was my best time with discovering stuff, etc., etc., etc. I then fell in love with a young lady called Charlotte, who is still with me. And we started seeing each other. She started living with me, and at about 1986, and then I met up with a young man called Mark Ascoli, who was the art director for Yohji Yamamoto. Now, I knew nothing about Yohji Yamamoto. I knew nothing about French fashion. I had lots of knowledge about British streetwear, the English scene, knew nothing. And Mark said he wanted me to do the menswear for 1986 campaign for Yohji Yamamoto. And he was a maverick art director. He was somebody who was launching people like Max Madukul. He's hugely influential in Power Reverse's development as an artist, really sort of strange maverick figure, really brilliant figure. The partner of Martin Sitbon. Anyway, so he asked me if I'd do the Yohji Yamamoto campaign. He invited me across to Paris. I went to the shows. It was a world I'd never seen anything of. The middle of the court cable, and all the people dressed completely in black, the audience completely in black, and these girls coming down, just these visions that Yohji Yamamoto had created. I was blown away. It was the best thing. And I love the fact that Yohji was saying, the women that I show you, they're about the person, they're about the poetry, they're about the soul, they're about the heart. They're not about their bust or their cleavage, neck or their back or any of their physicality. It's about the woman as a person. And that I thought was so inspiring. As I said earlier on, being in slight rebellion against the sort of Newtons and the sexualization of women and the sexualization of fashion photography, which had become so much of a kind of thing. I mean, I'm not criticizing it now, but at the time, it didn't fit at all with what I wanted to do. And then I discovered Yohji Yamamoto, and it's incredible. It's this sort of beautiful, poetic world of shades of dark blue and black, and then a splash of red and all that. Just so poetic. And I was absolutely in love. So I would spend the whole of my time from 1986 to 1990, basically dividing my time between Simon Fox and in London and ID magazine, and Yohji Yamamoto and Marc Ascoli in Paris. I used to live in Paris as a kid, so I speak French fluently. So that was all fine. I love Paris.
Right.
So it was some of the best years productively to do stuff. It was really hard, and we didn't get paid very much, to be honest. It wasn't like huge mega deals, but it was enough to survive on. It was a lot for Charlotte and I, because we were young, we had no money. So any bit of money was kind of a lot. So that was the sort of the 80s for me. And then I stopped working for Yohji in the 1990s. And ID magazine, by then, has sort of gone a bit off the rails, and different people have taken it. It just looked a bit of a mess. And so Terry Jones said to me, look, will I take it over as picture editor and try and get good photographers back in and try and put it back on the kind of a little bit more the sort of lines he'd created it. So that was my role at ID in the beginning of the 80s. And Robin Derrick, so getting back to young Robin, he had gone from ID, where he used to work, to the Face magazine after Neville Brody, who was the greatest of all the art directors with respect at the Face. Typographically, Neville is and was virtually untouchable. Amazing graphic artist. So his layouts of magazines were brilliant. He knew how to take a picture of yours, put it on a piece of type, and make the whole thing look amazing. Sometimes when you hand your pictures into a magazine, you're sort of worried about what the hell the magazine's going to do, and they usually do things with them.
Yeah.
With Neville, you would hand them in and it would be a joy. You'd see it like 3 months later and it would be a joy. I mean, literally, such a pleasure. There are very few art directors like that. Peter Sauer was another one. Brilliant art director. Anyway, so I'd worked, as I said, for Yohji until the 1990s. And then I had a bit of a change of heart. I didn't really want to work in fashion. I worked with Jill Sander for a while and Martin Sitbon for a while. And then Charlotte and I had children. We had our first daughter, Emily, 93. And I thought, you know what, I just stopped feeling fashion at the moment. I wanted to pull back and do something that wasn't anything to do with fashion. And it coincided with a friend of mine, David Chipperfield, who's an architect who built the house that I'm living in. That was a huge part of my life as well in the early 90s, because we had a house built for us, which is incredible. He had been approached by the Natural History Museum to do a permanent exhibition of man's relationship to plants. So I got immersed in that, and I worked night and day for a year, creating pictures, and I had a team of young photographers with me who were doing stuff, because if you're photographing an oak ceiling in Wales, you can't be photographing a Meissen teapot in Cardiff. So it was just totally intense. We had a little studio here, which is what David Chipperfield built for us, so that was working all the time. And I took a sabbatical year, everyone, away from fashion, and did that. To make this exhibition, I had to tell a story visually. So you had a big plant picture, like a rose or sugar cane or coal or whatever it was, and underneath that you had to tell a sort of history or the story of it. So obviously the sugar canes to do with slavery and to do with sweets and etc. And to do that, I had all these objects I photographed as sort of still lives. I had to bring them together, and at that point there was a new machine that was invented, which they sent me a video of, a VHS cassette, to show what this machine can do. It was called the Quantel Paint Box. It was basically a forerunner to Photoshop. All of a sudden, it was a new medium. It was like, okay, well, photography you can do in a darkroom, you do a print, and you can retouch it by airbrushing it or whatever it is. But this thing, you can take a head from one picture, and you can drop in a head from another picture, and you can change the background, and you can change the color of the shirt, and you can lift the colors up or put them down. Or you can one picture. All of a sudden, and like the name Paint Box, it was like being a painter. You could just paint whatever you wanted. It's not quite true, but there was that feeling of total liberation from the parameters that had defined photography for hundreds of years or so, certainly all the way through my career. And the Quantel Paint Box, it was like £300 an hour, which is a lot in those days. It was incredible. You had an operator who would sit here, and he would sit and operate the Quantel Paint Box. And it was set out in a room which was all a bit faux Victorian kind of leather couches, a very old money kind of look. But behind you, there was a window into a room which was full of bleeping computers and men in white coats. So it was literally like being on a deck of Star Trek or something, but set out like a kind of Victorian gentleman's parlor. So it was kind of weird. And that's where I discovered what we now call digital photography. I would scan my photographs, and they were printed in Norway, scanned onto the Quantel Paint Box. And then I could just do stuff I could never do before. I could literally take the key, the pen you used, and I could move my body around as if it was wet paint. Like, okay, well, Man Ray couldn't do this, and neither could Ansel Adams, neither could Helen Newton. And nobody in the history of photography has ever been able to do this. So why am I still a photographer? Because I'm not doing anything that those guys did. And that was the end of the 80s, early 90s. And that became a sort of thing where Photoshop started to get going after that. And then, of course, by 1995, you have the advent of the internet. And 1998, it gets to me, and I suddenly start to hear about it. And I thought, wow, that sounds really like incredibly, it's a global network. So you can put a piece of work on, and anybody can see it across the world.
Right.
This is 1998, there was no Facebook, there was no Photoshop, there was no Big Brother, that program that everybody watched at the beginning of the end of the 1990s. None of that existed. It was the magazines, and that's it. And so all of a sudden you had this internet. And I spoke to Peter Saville, the graphic designer I told you about, and he said, I think I've been approached by an internet company in LA, and they want to do an arts program where we choose the art and send it to them, and they put it up on the internet site. So I said, Peter, why are we doing that for them? Let's do that for us. And so that's where SHOWstudio started. Peter, incidentally, never became SHOWstudio because Peter was off doing something else, and when I started SHOWstudio, he wasn't interested or didn't want to do it or whatever, so I just went ahead by myself and started it. But it became obvious to me because I've been filming everything I did. So every time I did a shoot, I would put a video camera on a tripod, say to everybody on the shoot, hey, I've got a video camera on a tripod there. And back in sort of the 80s and the 90s, actually the early 2000s, everybody was like, yeah, okay, fine. And nobody thought anything of it. But it occurred to me that what I was seeing in front of me was unique, because there were 6 of us in the room, and one of them was Naomi Campbell, and the other one was Julianne Deese, and the third one was Linda Cantillon. Yeah. So you had these incredibly good people, like model headers and makeup artists, and the art director, but it was about 4 or 5 of you. That was it. And I thought, this is amazing, watching Naomi Campbell when she was 16 in a scarlet red Yohji Yamamoto coat, moving around, listening to a soundtrack by Prince, who had given her the cassette tape the week before. I thought, what a shame, there's only 6 of us seeing this.
Right.
I saw her move across the background and the flash going off and freezing her silhouette and the tungsten light on the front of her and all the sort of blur. And when the flash goes off, it freezes the silhouette. When the exposure captures the tungsten light, it blurs it. So you get these sort of beautiful abstract red shapes that she was creating. I thought, this is theatre. This is like some performance happening. There's 6 of us here. And then I started thinking, well, when Yohji created that coach, he never saw it to be a photograph. He created it to be seen.
Right.
So why are we all suggesting or convinced that actually the only way to show fashion and the best way is through a compromise, through a fashion photograph? Surely this is closer to what Yohji saw originally and what any designer sees, because no designer ever makes a piece of clothing to be seen as a still photograph, always to be worn, even gas on. So why the hell have we decided that the best way to show fashion is by fashion photography?
Yeah, just a question. Do you think it was shown in a still photograph because that's all we had? But once we had more, you would have thought it would have moved. You had to push it.
Well, things take a while to culture takes a while to change. They had previous to the internet, the only ways you could show moving fashion were in cinema. Now, cinema is hopelessly out of time with the fashion cycle. So the fashion cycle is arguably every 6 months. Films are like every 3 years. So you'd be like 6 seasons behind at best. So that doesn't work.
Right.
Television just wasn't interested. The people who ran television channels like the BBC or CNN or whoever, A, did not understand fashion, and B, could not see its cultural relevance, and they still can't. That's why if you buy a newspaper now, or if you go and watch the BBC now, every evening on the BBC, you will be told about football or golf or whatever it is, any sport, and they'll give shoot. They will never tell you about fashion.
Right.
Although fashion is a much, much bigger industry than football and sport, fashion is a much bigger thing than sport. Sport is actually quite small in terms of the revenue that comes through it. Fashion, much bigger industry, but they don't talk to you about fashion. And if they do, it's to say how stupid it is. And that all models are drug addicts, that all models are bulimic, that all predators, that's the only time you hear about fashion is when they want to slag it off and say, look at this stupid piece of clothing. We put one of our reporters in it and send them into rural God knows where, and everybody's laughing at them. And this is going to cost £20,000. So that's the only way they can get their heads around it. I noticed once when it was London Fashion Week, and I picked up a copy of The Guardian from a Sunday, which is called The Observer, and they had 6 pages, including the front cover, on the Tour de France, which was actually in Britain as well. They'd done the front page and 5 pages inside, all about the Tour de France. There was not one single line about British Fashion Week, not one. They had another magazine that had come out that talked about fashion, but nothing in the newspaper at all. And that's very much how British media and American media have treated fashion. And now it's in dreadful, I won't go into it, but it's sort of made into a Walt Disney-fied version of fashion, where it's all sort of like Devil Wears Prada and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah. Let me give the quick setup to SHOWstudio since it is 25 years. So by the 2000s, you'd done it from idea to Vogue to W. You'd mastered the image, but once you'd done that, the next step wasn't to perfect it. It was to break it open. If the magazines couldn't evolve fast enough, you'd build your own. You've said, but then if you tell them everything, they'll just forget it. So you have to make it stay in their heart and stay in their mind and let them finish the story. Let them personalize your image. Let it become theirs. SHOWstudio is built on that principle of participation, process, performance, and letting the audience complete the work. In 2000, you and Charlotte founded SHOWstudio, the next evolution of the magazine, not print, not digital in the way we think of it now. A magazine that breathes, moves, shows process, not just product. Over 25 years, SHOWstudio has become the place where fashion and technology collide. Live streamed shoots, fashion films, McQueen's Plato's Atlantis show that became an industry standard, iPhone campaigns, collaborations with everyone from Björk to Lady Gaga to Kanye. You've moved seamlessly between Hasselblad and iPhone, between photography and 3D scanning, between studio and the screen. So you just talked about your frustration from the pedestrian display of fashion, either as still magazine imagery or if filmed as tabloid fodder. And you've said clothes are made to be seen in movement, that still images are fundamentally wrong for fashion. So you've had this realization. SHOWstudio is built on process, performance, and participation, but those are I think, the same principles of a magazine, right? So did you think of SHOWstudio as a magazine that breathes? Like, could it replace?
I think you have to go through what I went through in the 90s. So the 90s, I wanted to photograph people that looked like the woman I loved. So Charlotte's beautifully curvaceous. I thought, there's nothing wrong with women who are very thin. That's great. That's a look. It's not the only look. I want to photograph women of color. Why can't I photograph? They're beautiful. Why can't I photograph women in their 60s and 70s and 80s? They're beautiful. Why do I have to photograph people who are able-bodied? Because somebody has a different shaped body to you, even if it's through some sort of mishap or whatever, it's a person you're photographing. That's still beautiful. Why is every bloody Vogue cover the same sort of woman? Same age, same demographics, same sex, et cetera, et cetera.
Because of the samples back then.
Like, that doesn't stop older women wearing it.
No, it's true.
Black women wearing it. That doesn't stop whatever it is.
Yeah.
So I was very frustrated. In about the middle of the 90s, I started to really push against that quite strongly. And I was lucky enough to work with Alexander McQueen. We did a story for Dazed and Confused, actually, called Fashionable. So people like Amy Mullins, who had her legs amputated from the knee down, who opened one of his shows because I'd seen her on the front cover of some American design magazine. And I've got him to meet Amy, and they've gone really well. And we did a story, and she opened the show. So we started to talk about those sorts of things. We started to talk about women who were curvaceous and size 16 plus. We started to talk about older women. We started to try and push things. And magazines pushed back really strongly against that. Vogue ran one story about women who were size 16 plus. Weirdly, and I don't really know why I understand, Alex Schulman said, I'm never doing that again. Which is, why do you say that? Well, surely this is whatever. So I felt very much that I was fighting that magazine culture. Then on top of that, I became aware of how many magazine copies were actually sold. I had enough friends inside the magazine business to say, well, actually, when they say they're selling 60,000, they're selling 6,000. They're giving 54,000 away. Putting them on sort of flights to Eastern Europe, and they don't get sent back, but they copy it, they count as sales. And I'm thinking, well, that doesn't seem very honest. And imagine if you sort of think, okay, I'm going to get my work in front of 100,000 people, and it's 10,000 people. It's different to ask. Because I worked so much with photographers when I was at ID, and people like Corin and David and Craig and Jürgen and all those guys, thinking, you guys are being missold. You guys are being told people are seeing your work, and they're not. But the person who is making money is the person who's editing the magazine. They're making a lot of money because they're saying that it sells 100,000, so that Yves Saint Laurent, Gucci, etc., advertising the magazine, and they're getting a big sample of that, and you're getting to see nothing of it. So it felt like there wasn't a very honest relationship between the photographers and the stylists and hairdressers and makeup artists and the models and the person who's run the magazine. So I feel like I'm being conned. I feel like I'm being misled. I feel that my peers are being misled, and I also don't believe in the people you're making me photographs. Not there's anything wrong with them, but not exciting as the life I can just see around me. And then I had 3 children in the beginning of the 90s. And then by the end of the 90s, I realized that my kids weren't looking at magazines at all. And into the 2000s, they would never pick up a magazine. They'd have, whatever it was, MySpace or, whatever, I can't remember. And they would be on their computers and they'd look at stuff and they'd be talking to their friends on mobile phones, etc. And magazines were of no interest in whatsoever because we used to get sent them all the time. So I was working for them. So magazines would come through the letterbox here or arrive back at home. The kids would never look at them, never open, not interested, etc., etc. And you could see why. Because these were things which were already about the past. Fashions had already happened. Because they can already see on their social media what's happening now. So what's the point of the magazine? So it was a bit, well, this is redundant, this particular object. This doesn't work anymore. Fashion's better seen in movement. I want to photograph people who I think are incredible, whether they fit into your narrow version of what a model should be or not. But I want a whole range of people. And I also want you to be honest with me that you're just saying this because you want to get a lot of money. And that's your system. That's why magazines are still going. Because the bloody advertisers are still taking out £20 ads in the front of magazines. So all you need to do is get one advertiser and you've got a magazine. So
exactly.
Proliferation of magazines people aren't reading. And now you have a generation of people who say, no, but I want something physical again. I'm thinking,
it's like vinyl.
I love vinyl. I'm also thinking of, but it just doesn't feel very So it's slightly different now because there's a whole different bunch of things going on, AI being one of them. We can talk about that. But, in some ways, I felt I was trying to do something which felt honest and not felt about a sort of cultural, if you want, a cultural crime, which is why I saw it. There's millions of women, beautiful women of all ages, sizes, shapes and forms, and were not being represented in fashion at all. And the racism that existed in the early 90s was just absolutely through and through. And then you have the whole Me Too thing happened. Well, in a way, thank God. Because the way that fashion had grown up was to be protected from the opinions at the time. And, allowed all manner of kind of huge imbalance of power. You've got very young models, very highly paid, very wealthy, very well established figures. Of course, there's abuse. But
and no HR on set.
No, well, it was by people. But this abuse happens wherever you've got an imbalance of power, whether it's sport, ballet, or banking. But it just so happens that, I knew about the world of fashion. So it felt like something had to change. Part of the reason to call it SHOWstudio was to show people. I'm originally out of enthusiasm. Put a webcam on, which there's always a webcam on the studio as we film everything we do, and we broadcast nearly all of our shoots. Just say, this is actually what happens in the studio. I'm not interested in that Lothario version of a photographer. I'm not interested in using it as a sort of exploitation of people for my own sexual gain or desire or whatever it is. Actually, I'm interested in understanding what the clothes are about and trying to create the most beautiful images I possibly can create. Well, let's show people that, because it's fascinating and it's wonderful. To be in that place where, Gemma Ward walks down the stairs and she's been made up by Val Garner and her hair done by Sam McKnight and dressed by John Galliano, and Gemma walks and says, it's a vision. It's like the whole of kind of The Night Porter or Death in Venice. It's a vision. And it's the same way you can Night Porter by the one poster of Charlotte Rampling in the hat with the braces. You can, these visions that were created partly through the designer and partly through the makeup hairdresser and partly embodied in the model was so rich. It was allowing people to see that because it was amazing.
And the process is art in itself. I mean, that's the whole Jackson Pollock, it's like the whole process of making it's not always just the end result. It's the whole thing.
All the way through from conception to completion.
Right.
It's fascinating, and it's better for understanding what the art's about in the first place, rather than have this piece of removed art you don't understand. It's sitting on a pedestal in a museum or wherever it is. You're guessing at what the hell it's about. Why is that a better version of life than showing how it is made? There are different things. There's always a reaction. There's always a counter reaction to a reaction. So if I reacted strongly against it, in the end, it's a reaction against what I do. So, there's always that, and then I react against that. So fashion is very much about that to and fro, and that gives it its kind of pace. If you say, okay, this season, everybody loves yellow. I'm a stupid thing to say, but you know what I mean. Next season, somebody come and say, actually, everybody loves blue. And then somebody has to react against that. Fashion is it's a very puerile example, oversimplistic example to use. But there is that kind of, and that's what makes fashion advances. It's why I find it a fascinating medium, more fascinating than a bunch of the other, accepted art forms. Fashion's dynamic of change, of showing you something you can't see yet, of showing you something you're going to desire in 6 months, showing you something you haven't ever imagined. That's the dynamic that pushes me forward all the time. So I don't want to go and repeat what I've done in the past. I said, repeat what Jacques-Henri Lartigue did, or the Bailey did, or the Stephen Meisel did, or I'm not interested in plagiarizing or being inspired by photographers. They've done it and it's brilliant. I don't want to go and revisit it. I want to do something I haven't seen, not regurgitate something I have seen. That it's just trying to sort of find, life's so short and there's so many great things to do. So, why would you want to just go and repeat stuff that's already been done? But it does mean that you are permanently pushing at new things. And sometimes you make a mistake, and it's like nobody understands, and neither do I, but you had to do it. But it's every step on that journey you have to take. However wrong that step might have been in respect to the whole journey, but you had to take it. So every time you take a picture, it has to be important. Every time you try and do it, it has to be the best thing. And then recently, we've had the advent of 3D scanning. So now I'm making physical things. So I'm making 3D scanning a model, ending up with a statue, ending up with which I'm now painting. So am I
Oh
painting
my God.
myself? I'm a photographer. I mean, what the hell am I? In a way, who cares?
Well, I have a question about that. So the last section is usually looking back, but with you, it's about looking forward. You've said you're not a great believer in nostalgic digging into the past and that you always want to look forward. So instead of looking back, let's look forward. Earlier, we talked about whether photograph can depict truth, but let's talk about the word photographer itself. You've said that it rankles you and that it's a very restrictive description. You've said photography is dead. The digital revolution gave birth to a new medium. It takes in live performance, 3D scanning, fashion film, VR, AI, robotics. That's image making. You've also said, I think of images as conversations. Once you've asked a question and found the answer, there's no desire for me to go back and reconsider the same question. You've said photography itself stopped sometime in the mid-1990s, that what we do now isn't photography at all, but something else entirely. You just asked the question, what am I now? But it made me think, what if, so I looked up image, what an image is, and it can be in your mind and it can be something you see. But what are you past image making? How about if you can smell, like what you kind of dabbled in for the Costume Institute in Sleeping Beauty? I'm just trying to think, is image maker even the right term anymore, period? And then what comes after image maker?
There are many exciting things coming up. In a way, we are wrestling to try and define ourselves by the terms of the craft or the materials we use or what we do. So the camera or the darkroom or the AI or whatever it is, that shouldn't be what defines us. It's very prevalent, especially in photography, where people sort of say, what camera do you use and what lighting have you done? You can't imagine asking, I can't remember who, Joan Didion, what pen she wrote with, or asking William Shakespeare or whoever, whichever author. You don't care what pen they wrote a bloody book with. You care what the book says. So it's the same with what I do. In a way, it doesn't matter that I'm 3D scanning or using AI or that I'm painting or that I'm singing. It does not matter. What matters is what I'm trying to say and how much effect that has on you, not how I made it. And I think the whole trying to decide what to call ourselves, I made that very, if you want, I purposely made it a statement that would upset people, not because I want to make people sad, but because I wanted people to listen and start to think. Because I'm not a photographer, it's not my skill set. If you want to define my skill set, it's not defined by the skill of photography. I then do lots of other things. And I think it's really important that people understand that. Most of us take pictures on our iPhones now. My granddaughter. Most of us take pictures on our iPhones now. That's AI. Every photograph you take on your iPhone has been created in AI. So when people say, oh, we shouldn't use AI, so you want to stop using your iPhone then? You want to stop. Every film you color grade is graded in AI. Every satellite nav destination you ever find is AI. Everything we do has got AI built into it. So we're really putting a lot of creative energy into fighting AI, which I don't think we should be. That seems to me a slightly kind of weird thing. I can get behind the mindset of things should be made by hand, and that's it. But that's not what people are really saying. They're really saying, I'm a photographer and I bought all this expensive equipment. So.
Yeah, well, made by hand, I mean, it starts here. Yeah. Your hands are just what we use to do anything to get what's here out onto something, right?
Exactly as you say, it's getting your thoughts in front of other people so they can share your thoughts. That's great. And that's all we do. We're really just communicators.
Exactly.
Medium that we choose to communicate, be it painting, sculpture, AI, whatever it is really very important. So we've got nothing to say, we've got nothing to say. And we've got something important to say, we find a way of saying it. If you've got something really important to say, it doesn't matter what method you use, it's get the thing across to get the idea. Get what
I had a question, and it's funny. My question started with, you've called AI thrilling and said artists have a moral imperative to engage with technology. But what's at stake if artists don't? And what's at stake if all artists do? And how will the masters be studied and remembered? Do you think there will always be people who return to film and the darkroom the way vinyl collectors reject streaming because something essential is lost in seamless digital, no?
Well, it's hard to not mention this. That's right. You know, a lot of people love steam engines. They're beautiful. They make great big puffs of white smoke and they chug along, and that old-fashioned way of travel was fantastic. It's beautiful. I completely endorse. I 100% agree. Train travel and the old steam engines, beautiful. It's not how we get around anymore.
Right.
Not right for now. Because you can take an old painting like a kind of Holbein or a Rembrandt and you can put it through an AI and make it move and talk. You can even go, oh, that's horrific. We shouldn't touch these things. These are sacrosanct. We mustn't get involved. We can't do that. Or you go, wow, so how does that happen? How can I start to work with that? And what, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I don't come with a prejudged thing that anything that's new is wrong, where a lot of people really fear change because it means they have to reevaluate what they really love. And actually, I really love change. I really like that fact because it feels like we're seeing more and more of them, using more and more of our brains. So I get the whole anti-AI thing, but it's quite hypocritical because there's so much AI in everything we do. And if you're going to reject all of that AI, then that's fine. But actually, I don't see it as a threat. I don't see it as something that is going to be the downfall of humanity. And I'd go further than that. Anybody with a creative mind, you know, just because I use AI, I also paint. And I also make things out of bits of stick and glue and all those things. But nobody's criticizing, well, I don't really know I do most of those things. But it's not the only thing I do. It's part of a whole range of things.
Right.
We're just using what we can, trying things out. AI has been around. I mean, in truth, it's been around since the 1950s, but its present form, what people are reacting to, has been around for a couple of years. I can take a still picture and I can turn it into a film. Now, irrespective of touching things or changing, all the sort of negative, if you just ignore the negative things for a second, just to evaluate, that crosses from one medium into a new medium. And all of the sort of color grading I put on the still, and all of the retouching I put on the still, and all of the way the closes that's in the still, and the lighting on them will move into the film. It's incredibly hard and expensive to get the amount of retouching and grading, et cetera, in a film. That would cost me thousands of pounds. With an AI, I can do it easily. But irrespective of the money it would cost or save, which means I can actually do it. Because if I had to do it by film, I could not employ a color grader from Hollywood, and he or she would probably get it wrong because they can't work in the way that my retoucher works. So I would have to work with a worse artist, which is often what happens when you have to grade film. It's a really, really hard thing to do. Anyway, but my point is that we are now being able to, you know, I can put a picture into an AI and get a poem out. You know, I can put a piece of writing into an AI and get a statue out. So having these different ways that our minds work, which historically have divided straight down the line of, well, I'm a linguist, I'm a visualist. So I take pictures or make paintings or do sculptures, poems, and I write novels. It's taken those and it's blurred them. And that's huge. And
yeah,
I know there's lots of negative things, but one mustn't just dwell on the negative. The possibilities, the artistic possibilities, are incredible. What I find really odd is that artists are really going, oh no, but that's so reactionary. I get them. Yeah, you want to talk about the pollution, I'll totally go into that argument. You want to talk about plagiarism, I can talk about that. I make my own data sets. I get all of my pictures, I put them in a data set. They're pictures that I've taken. I'm not going.
right,
If you're worried about plagiarism, create your own data set.
right.
If you're worried about plagiarism, think how many times that your pictures have been on mood boards for shitty.
Exactly. That
You never see, you never get paid for, and if you try and sue, it's a nightmare. So, you know, that's where your plagiarism's happening. But if you go into the Louvre, don't make any jewelry, if you go into the Louvre, or you go to MoMA, you're looking at a Rembrandt, you're looking at a Velasquez, you're looking at, and you go, okay, so then you go back home, you do your painting, photography, whatever it is, but you've still got those things sparking in the back of your head, the way that the light falls, the way that it illuminates the face, the lighting from underneath here, all of those things. So you're just pulling on references. The other thing is when you work with AI, and there's lots of forms of it, so it's not this one thing, the common perception is that I want to write a pretty fashionable girl sitting in the chair dressed in Saint Laurent. And out comes an image, you go, fantastic, I've got an image, now off you go. That's like saying, as a photographer, I go into the studio and I put my camera in front of the girl dressed in Saint Laurent, I press the button, and I got a picture, so out I go.
Exactly.
Reprompting, finding the words, changing the words, etc., etc., etc. And then I can put in an abstract photo. I go outside with my camera, take a picture shaking it, all blurred. I'm going to put that into an AI. I'm going to say, resolve this, rationalize this. And then the AI looks at all the bits of colored streaks, all the bit with it, and resolves it. And I say, okay, make it three-dimensional. And it prints me out a three-dimensional object of my abstract as it's resolved. I then paint it by hand. Where's the lack of human involvement in that?
Yeah, you're still the conductor, you're still the magician, you're still the director.
So that's why I'm fascinated by it. I find it amazing. I understand why people are fearsome of it. And if people are going to lose their jobs, that's bad. I'm not advocating that people should lose their jobs, but I think it's really hard when you get a lot of people who A, don't use it, B, don't understand what the possibilities are, C, don't have any cultural references to put it within, and only see it in terms of the most negative cliched about AI. The other really big problem is, if I, as an artist, say I'm representing the artistic community, so we're not going to have anything to do with it. This is not for us. We're going to go back to our painting and our sculpting and our photography, and that's us. Okay, you think it's going to stop? You think Zuckerberg's going to stop? Yeah. You think Sam Altman's going to stop, or any of those guys? They're pushing it because they find it fascinating. It is going to get more and more and more and more, and you're going to stand on the sidelines and go, well, it's not for me, I don't want to do it. You think you're going to stop it advancing? And the people who will use it will be the people who make a lot of money from it, so big business, and they will put more and more paywalls, so, the rich will be able to use it properly, and then the other people are using it in the military. So they will work out how to use it to kill people. Okay, so you are allowing a culture to develop, again, which is based on killing and greed. Now, we've got a culture that is based on killing and greed. It's colonialism, it's the empire, it's all those things. That was based on killing and greed. As a British citizen, Britain was very responsible for killing and greed. I was hoping that this new invention of a global communication platform could make something which would give us another chance to look at society again and say, actually, it shouldn't be about killing and greed. It should be about human emotion, or it should be about understanding, or it should be about communication, or it should be about new ideas, or opening our minds up to different ways of thinking. That's what it should be about. If the artistic community turn their back on it, it is not going to go away. And also, it's this generation of the artistic community. A child who's being born now will grow up accepting it and will just naturally take it on, just like the generation using their mobile phones. It will be part of what they do. They'll express themselves through it. They won't think about it, question it, or say it's plagiaristic, or people are going to lose it. It's not going to be on their reckoning. So it's better to have this new medium, this new visual culture, or this new culture formed by artists than businessmen and the military. So I think I get a little, not evangelical, that'd be the wrong word, but a little strongly, I want to defend it, because I don't think they're right. When I publish something on my Instagram page and I get like 50 people telling me I should go away, I don't think they're right. I really want to hear reasoning. I really want to hear the counter arguments, but I'm not feeling that they're holding up. The one that's a bit more problematic is the pollution and the water that's used to cool this, but then there's different ways of cooling it. There's deep sea water cooling, there's air cooling, there are different ways. And just like when NFTs were first around, they were incredibly polluting. But by the end of it, they changed them so they were using like a fraction of the amount of power it takes to send an email. So these things do change. I get now that they're not, but also you've got to look at the people you're allowing to do this. You're not asking great artists to be in control of it, you're allowing the usual contenders, Mr. Musk. And
exactly.
You're allowing these people to do it, and you're turning your back on it. So I think it's the appropriate thing to do. But it's, as I said, it's all reaction and reaction against, and that's what life is. It's a sort of exciting conversation. I just think it's a shame that people aren't, in a way, they can't see the possibilities of this and what could be done with it and all those sorts of things. And also, we're talking about in the arts, but in science, there's huge leaps are going ahead. They're finding cures for diseases that nobody before. They're allowing poor people to have access to high quality legal defense through AI. There are things that are good about it.
Right.
And this is a slightly kind of, I think it's important, but it's a more inflammatory comment. We think that we are the end of the evolutionary line, that we think that this is perfect, that there is no way you can improve on this. Now, I would argue against that quite naturally. We don't know where we are on the evolutionary line. We could be back with the kind of amphibians. We don't know where we're going.
Right.
We're presuming that the figure that we have of ourselves that's been around for the last couple of thousand years, and that's about all, is the end of the evolutionary line. We cannot be tampered with. I would say, as an ex-scientist, I don't think that's really looking at the facts. We are part of a journey, and if our journey means that we are going to become less useful as humans and more useful as another form of intelligent life form that might be silicon-based rather than carbon-based, that's evolution. Now, if you want to stop evolution, that's a really bad idea, because otherwise we'd all be Neanderthals still, or before that. You just talk to a Neanderthal, I'm sure they would say they were perfect.
Exactly.
They wouldn't be able to talk to you. But my point is, we don't know where we are. And it's a very, very arrogant position to say we are so correct. We humanoids can't be touched. It's not that I'm anti-human. No, for Christ's sake, I spent my whole life falling in love with people because of who they are. I think humans are absolutely fantastic, but we can't pretend that we're never going to change and never going to evolve. And we're going to evolve towards a better state. My theory that I've come up with over the last 5 years or so thinking about this is actually maybe our most important thing is to hold on to intelligence and to keep intelligent thought alive or growing or whatever it is. We've all getting very excited about 31 Atlas or whatever it is, but it's probably just a large chunk of rock coming from billions of miles away. They found water on Mars. Well, great. It's like, yes, but there isn't any real proof yet of any other form of intelligence in the whole of the universe. I'm not saying there isn't any, but there's no proof of it. So why are we behaving like there is? There's no proof of it. There's no proof of any God. There's no proof of any of those sorts of things. So sure, we can all get very religious and decide that we're good Christians or Jewish or whatever it is and believe in things that clearly aren't true. We ought to also act as that there's no other life, that there is no God. You know, all those things are important. What we have got is intelligence. And that's what we need to preserve. And so it's not about good and evil. It's about preserving the most magical thing that this species has been able to create, which is intelligent cognitive thought. So perhaps whatever vessel or shape or person or whatever it is that can continue that growth of intelligence throughout what could otherwise be a dead universe is probably the most important thing we have to do. And facilitating that evolution is what we should be doing. So that's my view on things.
I mean, I think that's a great place to end, personally. I think it brings us right to the edge of where the future begins.
Well,
right.
We'll see.
So, in closing, Nick Knight, you opened this conversation talking about following your desires, creating images you want to see rather than images you can see. For 40 years, you've been creating what doesn't exist, from ID to The Face, to Vogue, to SHOWstudio. You've shown us that fashion images can be dangerous, emotional, inclusive, alive. You've shown us that manipulation isn't lying, it's seeing. And you've shown us that the future of magazines isn't print or digital. It's whatever allows us to see what we couldn't see before. You've said the finest photographs show us what we cannot see. Thank you for the masterclass today.
My pleasure. Helps me think. So it's been my
Thank you.
Lovely to speak to you.
Okay, have a great day.
All the best. Bye-bye. Bye.
Okay, bye. Okay, that's our show. Thanks for listening to Going Rogue. And be sure to like and subscribe. Today's show is produced by me and Maddie Rosenberg at Radio Free Rhinecliff with assistance from Maddie Kelly. Special thanks to David Vo for our great graphics and Taras Romanov for our epic theme music. See you next Friday.